Okay, welcome to everyone to our studies of the Parasha with my friend for the year, our friend for the year, I should say, ve-ha-Kabbalah, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg. And as we have seen and we'll see again tonight, his style is to always look closely and very creatively at the language of the Torah and to specifically demonstrate how the rabbinic tradition emerges from a close and nuanced evaluation of the text itself. I hope I haven't put you off in those few words of intro. I know probably that you're already familiar and expert in his style. So let's see what he will teach us tonight, what we can learn together about Parasha's Tazria. Parasha's Tazria, of course, is dominated by the phenomenon of tsaras, which is usually translated as leprosy or leprous affliction. Of course, it's not exactly leprosy, but it's something somewhat akin to it. And it is highly technical in nature, I have to say. And nevertheless, I hope that we'll learn some fascinating insights together. So let's start at near the beginning. Actually, the first part of the Parsha we're not going to deal with tonight. So we'll begin with Perek Yud Gimel, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Vayidera Hashem al Moshe vel Aharon lemor. If you're using the Art Scroll Chumash, it's on page 608. Hashem spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, saying, Adam ki hiye be'or v'saros se'es o sapachas o beheres. A person who has on the skin of his flesh, se'es is a leprous mark which appears to be elevated. O sapachas. Now, I'd like to look tonight, initially, at this word sapachas. Now, the Art Scroll people render it without translating a sapachas. If you look in the English commentary, so they maintain that the word sapachas is not a type of leprous affliction in its own right, but rather it's a generic term for a secondary affliction, like a secondary category. Now let's explain how that translation emerges from the word. Now, sapachas actually means an appendix or an appendage. Kabbalah says it's tosefes al ha'ikar, something which is added to the principle, which is added to the primary subject. So we find, but it's an addition, or it's like an appendage or an appendix, but it is inferior as well. It's just like an add-on, and it's something which is inferior to the principle. And actually, the Torah says in a few verses later, if you take a look at Pasuk Vav, verse 6, the Kohen will observe him on the seventh day once more. And it may be the case that the nega is the prominence of it, or the conspicuous quality of this affliction has diminished. It has not spread. Kohen, then the Kohen shall pronounce him ritually pure. He's tahor. He's not tamei. He's tahor. Mispachas he. It's merely a mispachas. Now, the word mispachas clearly is related to the word sapachas. Says ve-ha-Kabbalah, the difference may be as follows. But first, let's explain what sapachas means in terms of its derivation. So we find, for example, a pasuk in Shmuel Aleph, Sfacheni na el achas hakuhunos. Now, this pasuk was said in the context of, just a little bit of background, Eli HaKohen, he was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest in the days of Chana, the mother of Shmuel Hanavi. Chana and Elkanah were an important couple. He was a Levi. Elkanah was a Levi. He was a very respected personality, and he had a wife called Penina, and she bore him child after child. He had another wife, Chana, who was barren. Chana, on one occasion, prayed in a heartfelt manner. She bore a son, Shmuel, became the famous Shmuel Hanavi. In the meantime, Eli, who was the leader, the religious leader of the generation, was not flourishing in terms of his accomplishments or in terms of his family. He had sons who were a bit wayward, And therefore, the prophet in the book of Shmuel, there is a description of how Eli was given a prophecy that his descendants are going to essentially die out as a punishment for various failings. Particularly, Eli, failed to rebuke his sons, who, as I said, were somewhat wayward. But this is just the background to that expression. So the prophecy to Eli was that your descendants will be so desperate, they will have fallen so far from their descent from the Kahuna Gedola, from the high priest, that they will plead, they will be like pining for some kind of association with any of the families of the Kohanim in order to receive a coin or a handout, because the Kohanim did not have an allocation of land. So those who were worthy served in the Beis HaMikdash and were respected and were admired and were supported by the community. Those who were kind of down and out, the outcasts, even if they may be Kohanim, but they may struggle. In any case, that's the context of it. And there we have the expression, please add me on and enable me to associate, to be to affiliate, to be an appendage to one of the established and respected families of Kohanim. We have the expression Sefichin, Sviach Ketzircha lo Siktzor. This is a pasuk later on in the Torah, I think in chapter 25, where we have the mitzvah. It's chapter 25 in Vayikra. We have in Bahar, I think, we have the mitzvah of Shemitah. Today, this is the Shemitah year, currently the Shemitah year, and we have the mitzvah of Sfichin. Sviach Ketzircha lo Siktzor. Sviach Ketzircha, it's rendered as the aftergrowth. It means something which is incidental. When they harvest the crop, so a few seeds, a few grains of wheat or whichever product it may be, may fall to the ground and may germinate, and they'll grow not by deliberate intention, but just inadvertently. That's called sefiach. So says ha-Kabbalah, he says that's why this sapachas, where there is some evidence that the primary mark, the leper's mark, is either spreading or it's extended, or there's some evidence of its effect on the healthy skin, and it's expanding, but the expanded part may only be an appendage to it. And then for that reason, the question is whether it really does expand or perhaps it stays the same. But then he adds on something further, which I find very insightful. He says there's another approach which is related to this, but listen to the elucidation that he suggests. He says mispachas and sapachas, these two terms, they are both incidental and they come from without. Now the meaning is this whole phenomenon of tsaras, as I'm sure you know, according to our tradition, is associated with Lashon Hara, and generally speaking with a failure of character, a person whose midos are defective, a person who is arrogant, a person who is self-centered, a person who is niggardly, he doesn't share what he has. And most of all, if a person speaks Lashon Hara, then he or she, as we have the example of Miriam, may be punished with the affliction of tsaras. That means that tsaras is something which comes from within. There's an inner failure. There's an inner corruption or failure of character, which is manifest on the outside. But he says the word sapachas, because that's like it says in the very beginning, seis or sapachas or baheres. So the sapachas is something which only comes from without. In other words, like we said, it's incidental. It's not primary. It's secondary. It's like a person who touches something that he's allergic to. So there can just be, surface contact with the skin, and it can cause a rash. Like if you're hiking sometimes, I'm not sure whether you have it here in Britain. It's been a long time since was going to say, since I was a Boy Scout, I never really was a Boy Scout. My father was a Boy Scout, and he could recognize different types of plants. And the most famous in Indiana, anyway, is poison ivy. We say leaves of 3, let it be, because that's the telltale indicator of poison ivy. And if you touch it, it will cause your skin to break out, itchy. It's a rash, very unpleasant. It's not seriously toxic, but it's best to avoid, just as I say, by way of analogy. So he says that the sapachas is something which comes from without. So a true nega, the true tsaras, comes from within. And that is a leprous mark, and the Kohen will identify it, or the Kohen will evaluate it. And that's something which comes from within. But this sapacha, so if it spreads, then that is an indication that it does reflect an inner failing. But if it just stays the same, then one can attribute this to an external force. Now, when I said the poison ivy analogy, I didn't mean it literally, that that's the only problem with this person, that's the cause of his sapachas. But just by way of analogy, something which is external, which is incidental, so it's not innate, it's not something which is essential to the person, and the saras is a manifestation of it. It could be something which is only happenstance, it's only an external influence. I'd like to clarify this by elaborating upon it a little bit further. Sometimes it's true for adults. It's especially true for children. I would say for older children, teenagers, for those who are teenagers or who have teenagers, who have been teenagers. And I think probably all of those various possibilities probably affect us all. But it's not only for teenagers. We are all subject to the influences of our environment, of our peer group, what's known as peer pressure. Peer pressure is often construed as something negative. It can be positive as well. There can be positive pressure, that is to say, to achieve or to emulate the efforts and the fine qualities that we may see in our friends or our peers or our classmates. But of course, often it's not necessarily for the better. So you can have a case of a person, he may be wayward in some respects, this teenager, but you may need to consider, or he may need to ask himself, when I say you as a parent or as a teacher, is this innate? Is this behavior, does it reflect his like a kind of perversity of character, or is it just an influence? Is he just susceptible to the influence of others? So the sapachas would be the view that his behavior, which is maybe objectionable, maybe dangerous, maybe self-destructive, hopefully not grievously so, but morally questionable or corrupting, is it really his innate quality, or is he just influenced by others? My late father-in-law, Dr. George Fox, Alav Shalom, once told me, was a child psychologist, and he knew a great deal about the children, about teenagers, and about motivation and that sort of thing. And he once told me that Rav Simcha Wasserman, Zichron Livracha, would consult with him sometimes about boys in the yeshiva high school, who were problematic. And I remember he once told me that Rabbi Wasserman said to him that the most difficult questions, the most difficult problems that he faces are in the instance of a child or a student, a teenage boy who is a bad influence. Maybe he's engaging in illicit behavior, smoking illicit substances and that sort of thing. We're talking about Los Angeles in the 1970s, probably marijuana capital of America. And he said the problem would always be, of course, if you expel such a boy from the yeshiva, who knows what will become of him? Probably he'll only get much worse. On the other hand, if he is an adverse effect on the other boys in the yeshiva, then how can you keep him? Because you may be like preserving or somewhat maintaining the standing of one student, but you're going to do so at the cost and at the deleterious effect on the others. And the reason I'm mentioning it now is I think it can be seen in terms of that Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg says here. Is this boy, we're talking about boys, could be girls as well, just susceptible? Is he vulnerable to the influence of others? Or is he himself the source of the influence? Is he a ringleader? Is he the alpha male who's actually influencing or drawing others after him? Or perhaps no, he's just impressionable and vulnerable and susceptible to negative influence by others. So I remember my shver said that these were difficult questions that Rabbi Wasserman would sometimes face, and he would consult with Dr. Fox in terms of what to do in this particular case. But the point is, the distinction about sapachas always refers to something which is a Tosefes. In modern Hebrew, nispach is an appendix, like an appendix to a monograph or to a book or something like that. An appendix, something which is additional to, and something which is probably like secondary to that which is primary, and it comes from without. If it comes only from without, then it may become tahor, and the affected or afflicted individual can put it behind him. If it's something that is innate and comes from within, it requires a more thorough process of purification and correction. Let's turn a few verses later now, and another I find fascinating example of something which I used to wonder about. I know I've sometimes said I never realized it, I never thought of it until he drew it to my attention. This is something which did occur to me, but I never recognized the wisdom of the interpretation, which I'd like to share with you right now. Okay, so it's in Pasuk Yud Gimel. I'm sorry, Pasuk Yud Ches, excuse me. It's Perek Yud Gimel, chapter 13, Pasuk Yud Ches. Uvasar, verse 18. Uvasar ki yevo v'oro shchin v'nirpa. Once again, the Hebrew here is essential. I'm sure everyone here has good Hebrew skills, but if you rely on the English, then the nuances that we're highlighting may escape your grasp. So let's look at the Hebrew. Vasar ki yevo v'oro shchin v'nirpa. If flesh will have an inflammation on its skin, and it will have healed. Now, the observation that I had thought about many times, but I didn't know what to make of it, is the word basar, which means flesh. Is that related to the word bisorah? Like we say in Birkat Hamazon, that's a place that's very familiar to us all. Harachaman yishlach lanu es Eliyahu hanavi zachur latov. May the All-Merciful send us Elijah, the prophet of blessed memory. V'yivaser lanu bisoros tovos, and may he herald for us good news. The word bisorah means news, like information which someone is conveying to another person or a group of people. That's called bisurah. Now, usually it's bisurot tovot. Occasionally it can be the opposite as well, but usually the word bisurah means good news. So, but it can be the other way around as well. I mean, it can be bad news also. So is there a relationship between the word basar and bisurah or bisurot tovot? Sometimes when we hear bad news and we commiserate with one another, we may say, nor basuras tovos, may we only hear good news in the future. Is there a relation between the word basar and baser? Baser is to convey news. He says, of course there is, because basar, the flesh, the skin, is projects and maybe reveals to the appearance or the gaze of others what is within. This is what I call a biofeedback, and that's why we called our shir today biofeedback, in the sense that a person can gauge his or maybe another person's well-being by considering his own body or that person's body, meaning that which is visible, the face, the flesh. And he says that the word basar is like he quotes like an aphorism that the body is the mirror of the soul. And he observes that if we find in the Hebrew language this idea in another way as well, probably familiar to you. The word panim means within, interior. I was in Israel earlier this week, and I went to the Misrad HaPinim, the Ministry of the Interior. Panim, pinim, lifnim, or lifnei means within, but the word panim also means face. So in Hebrew, you have the idea that the face reflects that which is within, and it's frequently the case that a person's state of mind or state of emotion is reflected on his face, whether it's a smile or a frown or a look of consternation. Very often, unless someone consciously seeks to conceal what's within, and even then, frequently his state of mind will be revealed, maybe in a candid moment on his face. They say in the name of the Alter Slabodka that a person's face is like a Reshus Harabim, it's public property, because I don't see my face, although I see it right now on the screen, but other people do. So the idea of pinim, meaning within, and panim, meaning face. And you have in the English language the idea that like a face is that which is external, that which is on the outside. The word fascia or the word facade, those all derive from the word face. But in the Hebrew language, the word panim means also pinim within, because the face reveals, it projects that which is within. And we find that, as I just said, in Hebrew language, like kol kavod bas melech penima, the honor of the princess is within. So we have this dual meaning, but it's not just a kind of uncanny coincidence that a word has a meaning and an opposite meaning, because, as we say, the face is a person's inner character is projected on his face. A person, but for that matter, if we talk going back to our subject, our immediate subject here about skin conditions, that it's very well known that stress and other forms of well-being, or the compromise to one's well-being, can be manifest in dermatological problems. I think that's actually quite often the case with dermatological conditions. And although tsaras is not merely a dermatological condition, but it shares that quality that if a person is, as we've been saying, guilty of lashon hara, or even things which are just within, a sense of arrogance, or a sense of self-importance, or sense of bitterness, it can be reflected in the skin. That's why it's called basar, because the flesh is baser, is the news. It reveals that which is happening within. It discloses it. It projects outwardly. Finally, there's one last example, which is once more so characteristic of the approach of Mitzvah of Kabbalah. And I didn't mean to tell you every time whether I did think of it myself or I didn't, meaning the problem or the question itself, where I did think of it. But this is something which I'm sure you have also come across in your studies of the Torah. I'm just looking at our participants tonight, all learned and well-informed Torah students. So turn with me to the last verses in the Parasha. I'm looking at chapter 13, Pasuk Nun Ches, verse 28. So there the Torah now moves from tsaras ha-guf, afflictions of the body, to tsaras ha-beged, the tsaras that can afflict a garment. Now, obviously, this cannot possibly be leprosy, which is Hansen's disease, because dermatological problems do not befall garments, but only skin, whereas tsaras can afflict a garment as well. And the Torah describes or prescribes a process of purification, a process of evaluation first, and then the purification. And we read in this verse, Pasuk Nun Ches, let's read the whole Pasuk. Ve-ha-beged o ha-shisi o ha-erev o chol kli ha-or asher tichabes. The garment, whether in the warp or the woof or even a leather garment, asher tichabes, which is cleansed, which is washed. V'sar mehem hanaga, and the evidence of the leprous mark leaves, meaning through a thorough laundering on the excuse me, on the extended cycle on your 21st century washing machine, and it removes the stain. then that's great. It needs to be washed again, and then it's tahor. This is a bit odd. If washing it was so effective, great, so you've done it. Why do you have to wash it again? So the Art Scroll people, of course, inform us if the garment or the warp of the woof, any leather utensil has been washed, and then the affliction left them, it shall be immersed again and it shall become pure. So we see that the word asher tichabes, initially asher tichabes means washed, laundered, cleansed. But a few words later, when it says once more, v'chubas, it shall be washed, then it doesn't mean washing or laundering. You don't put it in your Maytag or your Whirlpool or your Frankie, those are the more expensive ones, Mili, whatever you've got. But rather you immerse it in a mikvah. And so it is. Take a look at Rashi. I hope you have Rashi there. Rashi says, Im kishekapsuhu b'tchila, if initially when it was washed, laundered at the instruction of the Kohen, the nega departs entirely. It's cleansed. V'chubas shenis, says Rashi, lashon tivila. The second word v'chubas doesn't mean to launder, it just means to immerse in a mikveh. You cannot immerse it in your bathtub. You cannot immerse it in your laundry pail, which may have been used in earlier times, has to be immersed in a halachic mikvah. Lashon tevila. Says Rashi, Targum shel kivusin shebeparsha zu lashon libun. Every time it says kibusin, it means libun, cleaning, laundering, whitening. V'ischaver, that's the Aramaic translation. Chutz, except mizeh. It doesn't mean to launder, to whiten, to cleanse, but it means litbol, to immerse in a mikveh, in a halachic mikveh. Lekach targumo v'yitztava. Therefore, if you look at the Targum, we don't have to do it now, you look at it yourself, you'll see that the two words in Hebrew, although it's the same word, different conjugations of the same word, but in the Aramaic rendition, the first one is to launder, the second one is to immerse, and that's how the Art School people rendered as well. Says Rashi, concludes Rashi, v'chein kol kibusi begadim shem le'tvila muturgaman v'yitztava, and that is the way our Targum Onkelos renders the Hebrew into the Aramaic when the meaning is immersion v'yitztava. So how is it that the word kibbutz, which we all know means to launder, how is it that the rabbis understand it here to mean immerse, to mean immersing in a mikveh? And we find elsewhere, Rashi says, generally kibbutz means to launder, to cleanse. But in the context of purification, then it means to immerse. And we find that elsewhere in the Torah as well, that the word kibbutz is used to immerse in a halachic sense, in a ritual and method of purification. Says ha-Kabbalah something very insightful, and to me at least, not that he needs my endorsement, it has the ring of truth. He says that chaves is related to the word keves. Now, how is that related? A keves is a sheep. How is kaves, launder, related to a keves, which is a sheep? The answer is not that hard to come up with, because a sheep is white. I even looked it up. Yes, you have the phenomenon of the black sheep, the brown sheep, the speckled sheep, but sheep most of the time are naturally white. Part of that is probably by genetic breeding, because we want them to be white because then you can dye the wool the color of your choice. But I think even naturally in nature itself, the sheep tend to be white, which means that when the Torah says the word kaves is related to the word keves. Now keves is spelled chaf, ves, sin. Keves with a sin, and the sin and the samach are different letters, but they have the same sound. And it's well known in Hebrew, probably in English as well, really, that words with the same sound, in some cases at least, derive from a similar meaning. Maybe I'll scrap that in my comment about English, but it's certainly true in the Hebrew. But then he gives an example. Well, I'll give you the example actually at the very end. But then he says something further, that keves with a sin, meaning a sheep, is related to our word keves, but also the word kevesh with a shin. Chaf, ves, shin, kevesh. What does kevesh mean? We have the expression kavush k'mavushal for those familiar with that halachic category. We have perhaps better known Ezehu Gibar, who is powerful, hakovesh es yitzro, one who subdues his inclination. Lichvosh is to suppress, to press or to suppress. Like we have the expression machvesh. A machvesh is a press, like a clothing press, to press clothing so that the wrinkles are removed. Or a trousers press is called a machbesh. Also, like for shoes, it's a mold or something something which presses another object in order to create the intended shape. We have the expression yichvosh avonosenu. May Hashem suppress our sins. May He push them down and away from view, from view or from attention. Kovesh panav bakarka, a person who buries his head in the earth. It means to press down or to suppress or to press in terms of pressure. Says the Mitzvah of Kabbalah, kibus involves the meaning of kevesh, meaning to press together. Because the way that you launder something, that's how your washing machine does it. In the old days, a man or woman, sometimes women, would often women would do it themselves, which is hard work, but that's what. And you take the stain and you press you rub the garment one against the other, one part of it against the other, with some detergent, some cleansing agent, and that's how you remove the stain. So the word kivisa, washing or laundry, and the word kevesh, to press, are related. And he says that our word, which is to immerse in a mikveh, has the other related meaning of kevesh, which is to suppress, to lower. Like we said, if a person kovesh panav bakarka, he buries his head or lowers his head to the ground in an expression of contrition, perhaps, or humiliation. The word for kevesh, to lower, is what you have to do when you immerse a garment in a mikveh, because you cannot get the garment to go down into the water unless you press it, because every fabric that I can think of, unless you're talk about a chain mail of armor or something, is lighter than water. It all floats. Leather, polyester, cotton, wool, linen, it all floats. In order to press it down into the water, you've got to push it down. He says that is the meaning of tevilah. That's why the word keves, kivisa, does naturally accept, it naturally has the interpretation of both laundering in the sense of the keves of the sheep that is white, the cleansing, and it also has the connotation of just immersing into a mikveh, because again, as I'm sure you know, in order to immerse anything in the mikveh, a garment, which we don't have that much occasion to do halachically nowadays, a garment, but certainly a utensil, or if a man or woman immerses herself in the mikveh, the immersion must be total, and the person must descend into the waters of the mikveh entirely. If you do that with a garment, you've got to push it down. He says this is the word keves, which is related to the word, this word kivisa, keves, which is related to the word for sheep, which is related also to the word kevesh, which is to push down, or to press, or to suppress. And these are the meanings of the words. I'd just like to end with the last comment, which he adds to this as well. He quotes the Medrash. The pasuk says "Kvasim b'nei shana," and we're describing the sacrifices. So the Medrash says "Mechabsin avonosein shel Yisrael," that these kvasim, these sheep that are offered on the mizbeach, b'nei shana, 1 year old, they have the effect of cleansing the sins of Israel. And they make the Jewish people, that is to say, through the process of atonement, through atoning for our transgressions, and then we are like a child of 1 year old who is without sin. This is the drush. So when I saw that medrash many years ago, I thought it's just a play on words. because kavasim is like kibu, is like laundering and cleansing. But as we've seen here, it goes much deeper than that. It actually derives from the same word. The process of keves, of kivisa, is related to the lamb, the sheep, which is white. So these are some. I have to tell you, maybe I shouldn't say, but I'll confess, I did work quite a bit to come up with material that was suitable for our purposes for this year in a parsha which is, as we've seen, quite technical. Just to review very briefly, we've said that sapachas, the word sapachas means something which is an appendix, something which is added on, but it is just like an incidental appendage, not something which is essential. And we have discussed the suggestion that this sapachas perhaps is something which comes from without, maybe just through the influence of the environment. We gave the analogy of touching poison ivy, whereas the truth, nega, is something which comes unfortunately from within, and it represents a serious failing of the person, an internal failing, and therefore it's expressed on the surface. And we mentioned the analogy to a teenager, could be an adult as well, whose behavior is problematic. Is it essential, or is it just he's susceptible to influence? Or to put it differently, is his behavior leading others astray, or is he more of a follower than a leader? And that would maybe have implications for the right way to deal with such a scenario. We mentioned what I call biofeedback, basar meaning flesh, and baser to herald, to convey what is within. We said the word panim means inward, but panim also means the face. And there's a close relationship, because on a person's face, you can often see what's on his mind, or what lies within. And then finally, as we just said now, about the kivisa, the laundry, which is related, which sometimes the Torah tells, Rashi says, sometimes in the Torah it means to immerse ritually. And we said it really derives from the same idea of the kevesh, which is to rub together, to press, and also to suppress, to move it down, to push it down within the water. So we've gone over a few minutes today, but thank you to everyone for listening, and I wish you a wonderful Shabbos. And for those who are local to Kesha, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.